So the Trump DOJ just made one of the clearest statements that we've ever heard from the federal government when it comes to AR-15 bans. Not only has the administration now sued Denver over its ban on so-called assault weapons, but Harmeet Dillon, the head of the DOJ Civil Rights Division, is now openly saying that the administration's goal is to push these cases all the way to the Supreme Court and eventually secure a nationwide ruling that protects these types of rifles nationwide. And even President Trump amplified that message publicly, posting that a top DOJ official, Harmeet Dillon, predicts that the Supreme Court will eventually rule that AR-15s are legal everywhere in America. Now, that is a massive shift in how the federal government is now approaching these types of two-way issues, because for years the DOJ has often been defending these bans, but the Trump DOJ is now actively trying to dismantle them, and now they are pushing the pro-2A cause. So this is a very important, development that's now happening, a critical shift when it comes to 2A litigation. So let's break down what is now happening. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, the DOJ has now officially sued Denver over its ban on AR-15s, and now they've also doubled down recently, suing the state of Colorado over their ban on magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. The AR-15 lawsuit here argues that Denver's restrictions violate the Second Amendment because they prohibit firearms that are commonly owned by law-abiding Americans for lawful purposes. Now, that language is important because it goes directly back to what the Supreme Court has said in prior rulings like Heller and Bruin. The DOJ complaint specifically points out that AR-15 style rifles are owned by tens of millions of Americans across the country. And that matters because under Heller, firearms that are in common use by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes are protected by the Second Amendment. The DOJ is essentially arguing that Denver is banning one of the most common firearms in one of the most common platforms in America. Now, one of the more important parts of this lawsuit is how aggressively the DOJ attacks the underlying premise of these bans. The complaint describes the term assault weapon that is used by the city and other jurisdictions as well as a politically charged label rather than anything that has meaningful constitutional distinctions or any real definition to them at all. And then Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche made the administration's position very clear in this case. He stated that the Constitution is not a suggestion, and the Second Amendment is not a second-class right. That's very strong language coming directly from the DOJ, and it signals that this administration is treating these bans as a core constitutional issue, not just something that is a policy issue that they can ignore. Now, one of the biggest developments came directly from Harmeet Dillon herself, because she openly stated that the administration believes that the Supreme Court is eventually going to rule that AR-15s are protected nationwide. And more importantly, she said that the DOJ's goal, and actually what they intend to do, is help to make that happen. Harmeet Dillon specifically pointed to the Supreme Court's reasoning in Heller and Bruin, and she explained that the court has already made clear that firearms that are commonly owned by law-abiding Americans are in fact protected. And then she referenced the Supreme Court's unanimous decision in the PLCAA case, which was the Smith & Wesson case that was recently ruled on. And in there, the Supreme Court acknowledged that AR-15s are among the most commonly owned rifles in America. In fact, you even had liberal justices point to that very fact. Her argument is essentially this: if AR-15s are commonly owned, and the Supreme Court says themselves that they're commonly owned arms and protected, then she says the inexorable conclusion, in her words, is that AR-15 bans are unconstitutional. And that is now the stated position of the Trump DOJ. And again, that's a critical shift that we've seen from the federal government. We've never really had any other prior administration, no prior DOJ, even Republican DOJs openly pushing these types of 2A cases and making these public statements saying that they are going to strike down these type of categorical bans on rifles and also magazines. Now, here's where things get really important strategically. Harmeet Dillon openly acknowledged that there is currently a circuit split developing on these issues. You have some courts, like parts of the 4th Circuit and 7th Circuit, upholding AR-15 and magazine bans. And then you have other courts increasingly questioning that, those types of bans may be unconstitutional under Bruin. And according to Harmeet Dillon, the administration's goal is to help create favorable precedent in additional circuits so that the Supreme Court is ultimately forced to have to step in and resolve this issue nationwide. Now, that is a major statement coming from the administration because the DOJ is no longer acting passively on this issue. They are actively trying to shape the path to get one of these cases to the Supreme Court and force a ruling. And this is why this really matters even beyond Denver, because right now we have multiple major rifle and magazine ban cases moving through courts. We have a bunch of cases in front of the Supreme Court right now that have been going to conferences like Duncan, Vermontes, the NAGR case. And then you have some pending cases right now in front of circuit courts, en banc panels like the New Jersey ANGRPC case. And then you have the Illinois PICA case that's also pending in the 7th Circuit. And all of these cases are building pressure towards eventual Supreme Court review. But as of right now, the Supreme Court has not moved. But now the federal government is openly signaling that they want review to happen. And if the Supreme Court does not do it right now, they're going to push a case on their own and essentially force the Supreme Court's hand down the road. And honestly, this is one of the biggest shifts that we've seen in the modern kind of federal Second Amendment litigation. For years, the DOJ has often been defending these types of federal restrictions and also some state bans on rifles and magazines. But now this DOJ is taking an opposite approach. Under the Trump administration, they're actively being aggressive in lawsuits to help defend the Second Amendment. And they're making it very clear and openly discussing the goal of actually securing a nationwide Supreme Court ruling to protect AR-15 ownership. And that is completely different, and that's a different posture from what we've ever seen the federal government do in the past. Now, realistically, none of this is going to get resolved overnight. These cases still have to move through the lower courts. There are likely going to be appeals, and eventually one or more of these cases could reach the Supreme Court. But what's important is the direction that we're now going to head. And this sends a public message actually to the Supreme Court that if the court does not move on some of these cases that are currently pending in front of them, well, then the DOJ will continue to push their own cases and eventually force the Supreme Court's hands. So this Denver lawsuit may end up being much bigger than just, the city of Denver, because the Trump DOJ is now openly positioning itself to challenge AR-15 bans nationwide, and now they're also going after magazine bans. Harmeet Dillon is openly saying that the administration intends to push these issues towards the Supreme Court, and the administration's position is very clear. AR-15s are commonly owned, they're protected firearms under the Second Amendment, and bans on them cannot survive under Heller or Bruin, or Second Amendment jurisprudence, or the text itself. But now the big question becomes, what will the Supreme Court do in response? Will they kick some of the cases pending in front of them and just say, okay, well, we'll wait for other cases to get in front of us? Or are they going to see this broader message being sent to them and say, well, this eventually is going to have to happen, so we're going to address these cases in front of us right here and now. So that's a huge development right now in the growing fight over AR-15 bans, and the administration currently is pushing this to Supreme Court review. They want the Supreme Court to have to address this, and they're openly saying that eventually the Supreme Court will rule that these types of AR-15 bans are unconstitutional. So now we're going to keep our eyes on, not only the cases in front of the Supreme Court, but a lot of these actions and statements happening from the Trump DOJ, fighting it back against these type of AR-15 bans and also magazine bans as well. So as we get more information, as this unravels more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing this video. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.